the Arizona Territory, 1880. The sun rose over the red mesas like a forge door opening, spilling molten light across miles of sand and sage. Heat shimmered even in the dawn, a warning that the day would climb past 100 degrees before noon. The land looked empty from a distance, but nothing in that country was truly empty. There were always eyes on you. Coyotes watched from the ridges, hawks wheeled above the arroyos, and sometimes an Apache scout's silhouette would flash for a heartbeat against the horizon, then vanish back into the stone. On the edge of that vastness sat the town of Prosperity Wells, a settlement clinging to the belief that it could outlast the desert. It wasn't on most maps yet, but the railroad would be coming soon, or so the merchants kept saying. The town consisted of one main street of false-fronted buildings, a saloon with doors that never stopped swinging, a dusty general store, a church with cracked bell, and a handful of houses that tried to pass for respectable. The buildings leaned as if tired from holding up so many dreams. The people of Prosperity Wells lived by gambling, some with cards, some with cattle, and some with land deeds. No one embodied that gamble more than Jacob Hensley, owner of the Lazy H Ranch, a sprawling property that reached clear to the river bend. Hensley had come west after the war between the states with nothing but a pocketful of silver and an instinct for opportunity. By the time most men were still figuring out how to survive, he had built corrals, fences, and a fine two-story home with imported glass windows. To his neighbors, he was a success story. To the Apaches, whose water holes and grazing lands he'd fenced off, he was a thief who'd turned their birthright into profit. Every morning, the dust from Hensley's herds drifted toward town like smoke from a slow fire. In his house on the hill, his daughter Clara stood on the veranda watching that dust rise, sometimes imagining it was the sea she'd read about in books. Clara was 18 and restless in a way that made her father uneasy. She had the posture of a lady and the curiosity of a scientist, though the nearest thing to a laboratory she'd ever seen was the kitchen stove where she boiled creek water to look at the sediment. The townspeople called her the scholar behind her back, as if learning were a peculiar habit. To the east of the ranch, beyond the canyon, lay the land that no one dared fence, the territory of the Apache, who had retreated into the high desert after years of fighting. Rumor said a new leader had emerged among them, a giant of a man named Taza, broad-shouldered, calm, and educated in the ways of both worlds. Some claimed he could quote the Bible as well as the tribal chants. Others said he'd once served as a scout for the U.S. cavalry and left in disgust after watching his own people betrayed. Whatever the truth, his name carried a quiet power that made even gunmen lower their voices. It was into this uneasy balance that the story of the poker game would later unfold. But on that particular morning, none of the players yet knew the hand fate was dealing. In the saloon, the barkeep was sweeping up broken glass from the night before. Cards slapped on felt, coins clinked, and somewhere in the back room Jacob Hensley was boasting about a shipment of cattle hides that would make him richer than ever. The air smelled of whiskey, dust, and the faint metallic tang of expectation. Outside, a rider approached from the mesa trail, a tall figure on a paint horse, moving without hurry, as though the desert itself were clearing a path. The townsfolk who saw him first didn't recognize the face, but they would remember the moment later, when stories began to spread. For now, he was just another traveler passing through Prosperity Wells, though even the wind seemed to quiet when he dismounted. The sun climbed higher, turning the street into a glare of gold and heat. The town held its breath. Somewhere between the sound of hoofbeats and the shuffle of cards, the future was already being wagered. By nightfall, the air in Prosperity Wells had cooled just enough for the saloon's windows to fog from the warmth inside. Lantern light spilled through the slatted shutters, flickering against the dust in the street like restless fireflies. Inside, the Silver Spur Saloon was a storm of cigar smoke, laughter, and the hollow music of a piano that had lost half its keys. A crowd had gathered around the big table in the corner, where money, pride, and danger were all in play. At the center sat Jacob Hensley, his waistcoat stretched tight across a belly earned from success. His gray eyes, sharp and calculating, measured every man like a ledger. He'd been drinking since sundown, his voice booming as he bragged about his ranch, his herds, and his daughter's fine Eastern manners. A few of the cowhands laughed too loudly. No one wanted to be the one to anger the man who paid their wages. Across from him sat the newcomer the Apache called Taza, The light caught the copper tone of his skin and the long scar that ran just beneath his left eye, a souvenir from a cavalry saber years ago. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was tied neatly behind his neck. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and hadn't said more than a few words since he walked in. But he had a stillness about him that drew attention, the kind of calm that made the reckless uneasy. "Don't suppose you play, friend?" Hensley had asked when Taza first appeared near the table. Taza's dark eyes met his. "I play when the stakes are fair." Hensley chuckled. "You're in luck, then. Only fair men here." A lie, of course, but one everyone was willing to believe. The game began small. Silver coins, the occasional nugget of gold, a pocket watch or two. The cards whispered across the felt, the only steady sound beneath the murmur of bets and the scrape of chairs. Taza played quietly, folding often, losing small hands without expression. Hensley grew louder with each win, mistaking Taza's restraint for weakness. An hour passed, then another. The pot grew. One by one, men dropped out until only the two of them remained. The barkeep leaned on the counter, pretending not to watch. The piano player stopped mid-song, sensing something worth silence. Hensley smiled the way a wolf smiles when it thinks it's already eaten. "You've got grit, I'll give you that," he said, shuffling the deck with the practiced hands of a man who made fortunes off the backs of others. "But grit don't count for much when luck ain't on your side." Taza's gaze drifted to the stack of coins between them. "Luck," he said evenly, "is a word men use when they forget who they are." The words didn't sound like a threat, but Hensley felt them land just the same. He dealt. The final hand. Hensley drew strong, 3 kings. He could already taste victory. When the last card hit the table, he leaned back, confidence blooming across his face. "3 kings," he announced. "Looks like your luck's run out." Taza turned his cards slowly. A straight flush, black and clean as midnight. The saloon went silent. A chair creaked somewhere in the back, and someone muttered a curse under his breath. Hensley's grin faltered. "Well, I'll be—" "The bet," Taza interrupted quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You said your ranch, your land. Everything it stands for." Hensley's face reddened. "You can't be serious." "It was just a bit of fun." "You gave your word," Taza said. He stood towering over the table. "Among my people, a word is worth more than gold." The crowd shifted, uneasy. A few men reached instinctively for their guns, not out of loyalty to Hensley, but out of habit. Taza ignored them. He set his cards down with slow precision and met Hensley's gaze. "I don't want your ranch," he said. "I want what you took to build it." For a moment, no one breathed. Hensley blinked, confused, but deep down he understood. The color drained from his face. Taza wasn't here for money. He was here for justice. Without another word, Taza gathered his hat, turned toward the door, and left. The night swallowed him, silent as smoke. Behind him, Hensley sat frozen, his reflection trembling in the half-empty glass of whiskey. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound sharp enough to feel like laughter. The dawn after the poker game broke pale and brittle, as if the desert itself disapproved of what had been wagered. The wind carried a faint scent of sage and gun oil, prosperity wells waking up to another day of debts and secrets. Inside the Lazy H ranch house, Jacob Hensley sat slumped at the dining table, last night's whiskey bottle lying empty beside him. His face was gray in the morning light, the bluster gone, replaced by something smaller, fear mixed with disbelief. He had lost, and worse, he'd lost to an Apache. When he'd thrown his ranch into the pot, it had been part swagger, part showmanship. The other men in the saloon had jeered, and Hensley, too proud to back down, had spoken the words that sealed his fate. "I'll stake everything I've built. My land, my name, my legacy." Now those words felt heavier than stone. His daughter Clara found him there, still in his vest and boots, head in his hands. "Father?" she asked softly. "What happened?" Hensley looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Then with a groan he pushed the bottle away and muttered, "The Apache, Taza. He beat me." "Beat you?" she repeated, frowning. "At cards?" he nodded. "Won the ranch. Claimed I'd wagered more than I should have." Clara stared at him, not fully understanding. "You didn't—" "I don't know what I said," Hensley snapped, then softened his tone when he saw the hurt on her face. "It was just talk, girl." Nobody expected him to take it seriously. But before Clara could answer, a knock came at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Hensley stiffened. He didn't need to ask who it was. When he opened the door, Taza stood there, tall, calm, dressed in a buckskin coat that caught the light like river sand. He wasn't armed, though Hensley noticed the handle of a hunting knife at his belt. Behind him, the desert stretched endless in gold. "We have business," Taza said. Hensley's voice went tight. "If you've come to gloat, don't waste your time. You're not taking my land." Taza's gaze didn't flicker. "You gave your word. I was drunk." "Then you were careless," Taza replied evenly. "In my world, careless words still carry truth." Clara stepped beside her father, chin raised. "You can't just come here and make demands," she said. "We're decent people." Taza looked at her for the first time, and in that brief silence something passed between them. Curiosity, perhaps even sorrow. "Decent," he repeated quietly. "That depends on who you ask." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed, creased, and stamped with an old territorial seal. "This," he said, placing it on the table, "is the deed your father's lawyer filed 20 years ago. The land he built this house on belonged to my people. My father's village stood near your north pasture. The well you draw from was ours before your fences." Hensley went pale. He'd heard whispers, but seeing proof in the Apache's hand struck harder than any insult. "You're lying," he said hoarsely. Taza didn't answer. He simply turned to Clara, holding her gaze. "Your father didn't just lose a game. He lost the right to hide behind paper lies." The girl's throat tightened. "What do you want from us?" Taza hesitated before answering. "The truth restored, the land returned, and for your family to admit what was done." Clara glanced at her father, sweat beading on his brow. "That's impossible," Hensley muttered. "You can't undo history." Taza's jaw set. "You can choose to stop repeating it." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Taza turned, stepping back into the sunlight. "I'll return tomorrow," he said without looking back. "We'll see what kind of man you are in daylight." As his figure disappeared across the dust, Clara looked down at the old deed. The ink faded, but legible. For the first time, she wondered if the fortune she'd grown up in had been built on someone else's grave. Her father said nothing. The desert wind whistled through the window cracks, carrying away the last echo of pride from the lazy H. That night, the ranch house felt emptier than Clara could remember. The wind had picked up after sunset, moaning through the cottonwoods like something half alive. Her father had locked himself in his study with the bottle again, and the hired hands kept their distance, pretending not to notice. No one in Prosperity Wells liked talking about shame. It carried faster than wildfire in dry grass. Clara stood, by her window, looking toward the horizon where the mesas turned black against a sky scattered with stars. Somewhere beyond that darkness was Taza, the Apache who'd come to claim what he said was rightfully his. She could still see the calm in his face, the quiet certainty that made her own beliefs feel fragile. She had been raised to think of men like him as dangerous, savages, outlaws. Her father's words, the church sermons, even the newspapers from Tucson, they all said the same thing, that the frontier was being civilized and that progress required a price. But standing there now, she wondered who had truly been paying it. On her dressing table lay the old deed Taza had brought. The parchment was brittle, the ink fading into brown ghosts of letters. She traced the seal with her fingertip. 1874, it read. Her father would have been a much younger man then. Hungry, ambitious, maybe desperate. How many compromises had he made before success began to look like virtue? Downstairs, the clock struck midnight. Clara couldn't sleep. She slipped on her shawl, grabbed a lantern, and stepped outside. The desert night was alive with sound. The hum of crickets, the low call of an owl, the faint hiss of wind pushing through mesquite. The air smelled of dust and distant rain. She followed the fence line out toward the northern edge of the property, where the land dipped into a dry arroyo. There, by the pale wash of moonlight, she saw the old stones, half buried, worn smooth by time. Graves. 5 of them, arranged in a row, their markers carved in a language she didn't know. She knelt, brushing away the sand. One stone bore a faint engraving of a handprint. No name, no date. A chill crawled up her spine. These weren't Hensley graves. They were older. Apache, she realized. She stayed there a long time, the lantern's light trembling on the rocks. For the first time, the land she'd always thought of as home felt like something stolen, a treasure taken from sleeping hands. In the distance she heard a horse, not close but near enough to make her heart quicken. The rider appeared over the ridge, silhouetted by moonlight, tall, still, unmistakable. "Taza," she whispered. He stopped at the edge of the arroyo, the reins loose in his hand. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, his eyes taking in the graves. "They were my kin, my father, my sister, my uncle. Your ranch fence cuts through what used to be our village." Clara swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "I believe you." His tone held no accusation, only weariness. "It was your father who knew." She looked up at him then, studying his face in the lantern glow. The scar beneath his eye caught the light like a blade's edge, but his gaze was steady, almost kind. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will ask again," he said simply. "And if he refuses, I'll take what was promised in another way." Clara's heart stuttered. "You mean violence?" Taza shook his head. "No, justice." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage between them. "You think he'll listen to me?" she asked. Taza's eyes softened. "You're the only one he might." For a long moment, neither spoke. The night stretched wide around them, endless and ancient. Then Taza turned his horse toward the canyon. "Go home, Clara Hensley. Dawn is coming." She watched him disappear into the dark, her lantern flickering low. The world she'd known, the safe, ordered one her father built, suddenly felt as fragile as the parchment deed now folded in her pocket. As she walked back toward the house, the first hint of morning brushed the horizon. It looked less like light, and more like something being revealed. The morning sun rose over the Lazy H ranch like a judge, casting harsh light across the porch and into the rooms below. Clara had barely slept. Her thoughts had been alive all night, tangled between the graves, the desert, and the calm authority of Taza. Now, as the light spilled across the floorboards, she felt a weight pressing on her chest, truth she hadn't been ready to face. Her father, Jacob Hensley, was already in the study, hunched over his ledger as though it could shield him from the consequences of yesterday. The smell of stale whiskey clung to the room. Clara closed the door softly behind her and stepped forward. "Father," she began, her voice steady though her hands shook. "I need to know everything." Hensley didn't look up. "About what, girl?" "About the land," Clara said. She held the old deed in her hand. "About the people who were here before us. About Taza and the graves I found last night." Her father froze for a moment, then let out a long sigh. "I suppose it's time you knew the truth," he muttered. He leaned back, rubbing his face. "When I came out here, the West was a place of opportunity, but it was also a place of chaos. Men did whatever they could to survive." Clara frowned. "You mean stealing land?" Hensley flinched, but didn't deny it. "I inherited some claims from old associates who didn't care who paid the price. And yes, that land. It was taken from the Apache. We kept it. We built on it. I thought I was making a future for our family. But I didn't think about the cost." Clara felt a tight knot in her stomach. "The cost lives?" He nodded slowly. "Graves, villages, water rights stolen, names erased. That's why Taza is here. That's why he came to play cards with me. He wanted to see if I had the courage to admit it." Clara's fingers tightened around the deed. "So, When he won the game, he wasn't just gambling. Hensley shook his head. No. It was never about the cards, it was about accountability. He wanted me to see that a promise, even one made in jest, is still binding. And he wanted me to face what I'd done. Clara's mind raced. And the ranch? All of it? That's what I need to give back, Hensley admitted. Not just to him, but to everyone wronged. It's not easy. It's not fair. And it will destroy everything I've worked for. But it's the right thing to do. Silence filled the room, heavy as the noon sun. Clara realized something she hadn't before. This was bigger than any game, any wager, any fear. It was about justice. It was about facing the truth, no matter how painful. Father, she said softly, I want to help. I can't let him do it alone. Hensley looked at her, a mixture of surprise and pride in his eyes. You would stand with him? I'd stand for what's right, Clara replied, even if it means going against everything we've built, even if it means losing everything. He nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was settling in for both of them. Then we have a lot to prepare. Taza is patient, but he's not cruel. He'll give us a chance to make this right, and if we fail, well, he won't let the land lie stolen forever. Clara felt a strange clarity rising inside her. The desert she'd always known, the ranch, the fences, the herd of cattle, suddenly seemed small and fragile compared to the truth she now held in her hands. This was no longer just her father's problem, or even Taza's. It was hers too, and she had to face it, even if the road ahead was dangerous. By mid-morning, Clara had packed her satchel with supplies for the day's journey. She glanced one last time at the familiar house, knowing she might never see it the same way again. Then, stepping into the sunlight, she felt the wind push against her, carrying the scent of sage and sand. Somewhere in the distance, the mesas stood silent and unmoving, as if waiting to see what choice she would make. She was ready to meet Taza again, not as an enemy, not as a spectator, but as an ally. And in that moment, Clara realized that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with guns or cards. They were fought with truth. The morning sun was still low when Clara mounted her horse outside the ranch, satchel slung across her shoulder. She had insisted on accompanying Taza, despite her father's protests, and he had accepted with quiet approval. The Apache warrior was already waiting at the edge of the northern pasture, his paint horse calm beneath him, eyes scanning the horizon, as if the desert itself spoke to him. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. "I have to be," Clara said. Her tone carried determination, the kind that had surprised even herself. "If this land is to be returned, I need to see it. I need to understand." Taza nodded. "Then we move quickly. The longer the truth remains buried, the more danger it carries for both our people." They rode in silence at first, the horse's hooves stirring dust and gravel. Clara felt the weight of the satchel, heavier than it seemed, filled not with tools or papers but with the responsibility of confronting history. Every mile took them farther from the comfort of the ranch and deeper into the untamed territory her father had long feared. Eventually, Taza spoke, pointing to a narrow arroyo carved into the red rock. "We start here. These old riverbeds mark the edge of the village that once stood where your north pasture now lies." Clara dismounted, brushing sand from her skirt, and followed him to the edge. Beneath their feet, broken pottery and half-buried tools jutted from the ground like whispers from the past. She knelt to examine them, tracing a faint pattern in the clay. "These were homes," she murmured. "People lived here." "Yes," Taza said, crouching beside her. "And your family's fences pushed them aside. It was more than land, it was life, knowledge, culture." Clara felt a pang of guilt she had never imagined. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I didn't realize." "You didn't need to," Taza replied. "But now you do. And that knowledge carries a choice. You can hide behind your father's legacy, or you can face what was done and help set it right." She met his gaze. "Then we do it," she said. "We find the deeds, the documents, anything that proves my father took what wasn't his." Taza's eyes narrowed slightly. "It won't be easy. Some of the papers were buried or destroyed. Others are hidden in the town, in places controlled by men who fear losing power more than losing honor. Clara clenched her fists. Then we'll have to be clever. We'll have to be careful. Together they began their search, moving through dry washes and scrubland, Taza pointing out landmarks, secret trails, and hidden springs. Clara learned quickly to read the desert, which rocks held water underneath, which plants indicated fertile soil, which ridges offered safe lookout points. Taza's patience was infinite, but his lessons were exacting. By midday they reached the ruins of what had once been a small schoolhouse. Its walls were little more than stacked stones now, but a faint engraving on one of them caught Clara's eye. She knelt, brushing away dust and sand, revealing a line of names in both English and Apache. "These belong to the children," she whispered, her fingers tracing the letters. "Your people, the next generation." Taza nodded, pride and sorrow mixed in his expression. Even after all that was taken, they learned. They survived. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed from the distance. Clara stiffened, hand going to the satchel, and Taza raised a hand. "Quiet," he whispered. 2 riders appeared over the ridge, likely hired men from town, intent on stopping anyone from exposing Hensley's past. Clara's heart pounded. For the first time, she truly understood the danger of what they were doing. This wasn't just a journey into history. It was a battle for justice against men who would kill to protect their comfort. Taza's voice was low, but firm. "Stay close. Move slowly. Trust me." And with that, they vanished into the shadows of the canyon, 2 unlikely allies bound by honor, duty, and the knowledge that the truth they carried was worth every risk. The canyon stretched ahead of them, a maze of red stone and shadow. Clara had learned to follow Taza without question, moving silently across uneven ground, reading the desert through his eyes. Each day brought new lessons, and each lesson made her see her home and her father's actions in a new light. Taza led her to a small oasis, hidden in the curve of a dry wash. A spring gurgled gently over smooth stones, and a few desert flowers pushed through cracks in the rocks. Clara knelt, cupping the water in her hands. It was cold, sweet and alive, a stark contrast to the well water she had taken for granted back at the ranch. "You see," Taza said, settling beside her, "water is life. Every drop taken without respect hurts someone somewhere." Clara nodded slowly, letting the water trickle through her fingers. "I never realized how much the land gives and how much we've taken. That is why we teach respect," Taza continued, "not just for the land, but for all who live upon it. When I was a boy, my father taught me that every action leaves a trace. Some traces heal, others wound. Your father's choices left wounds. You can choose to help them heal." Clara felt the weight of his words. She had been raised to see the world as black and white. Settlers on one side, Apache on the other. But now the boundaries seemed to blur. Taza's patience, his calm authority, and the quiet dignity in his every action made her question everything she had believed. They traveled deeper into the canyon, and Taza pointed out ruins of homes, old stone markers, and faded trails. Each site carried a story: a family lost to violence, a crop failed by stolen water, a burial ground disregarded for a fence line. Clara listened, and for the first time she felt the pain as if it were her own. "Why did you come to Prosperity Wells alone?" she asked one afternoon as they rested on a sun-warmed rock. Taza looked out over the canyon, eyes distant. "To reclaim what was taken, but also to see if those who inherited it, the ones like you, could recognize the truth and choose to act. Not with anger or revenge, but with justice." Clara considered this. "And do you trust me?" "I do," he said simply. "Because you are willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to see beyond what you were taught. That is the first step toward change." As the days passed, Clara grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. She learned to navigate the desert, to read the sky, to find water where none seemed to exist. She also learned patience, humility, and the value of silence. Taza rarely lectured. Instead, he demonstrated, and she absorbed lessons quietly, letting them take root. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mesas, painting the canyon in gold and shadow, Clara and Taza camped beside a small fire. She watched him carefully shape arrows and sharpen a knife. "Why fight with men when you could take what you need by force?" she asked. "Because power taken by force is never lasting," Taza replied. "Respect and truth endure. That is why I played cards with your father instead of drawing a weapon. The game was a test, not of luck but of character. Clara nodded, understanding dawning in her chest. She had thought of the poker game as a gamble, a strange spectacle, but now she saw it differently. A challenge, a mirror held up to her father and to her, reflecting the choices they both must make. That night, as she lay beneath the stars, Clara felt a shift within her. She no longer saw the Apache as the enemy of her childhood stories. She saw people who had lived, fought, and survived with wisdom and courage. And she saw a path forward, one where she could help her father face the truth and restore what had been taken. The desert around her was vast and harsh, but she no longer feared it. In Taza's presence, she had found knowledge, respect, and a sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Clara felt ready to meet the challenges ahead, not as a daughter of privilege, but as someone who had begun to understand what justice truly meant. The town of Prosperity Wells seemed smaller when Clara and Taza approached it from the northern trail. Dust hung in the air like a curtain, and the streets were quieter than usual, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Word of Taza's presence had spread ahead of them. By the time they reached the outskirts, whispers had begun, some fearful, some angry, and some curious. Jacob Hensley waited on the porch of the Silver Spur Saloon, hands gripping the railing as he squinted toward the approaching figures. His pride had been battered by Taza's poker victory and the truth of the stolen land, but stubbornness still burned in him like dry brush waiting to ignite. Clara dismounted first, standing tall despite the tension in the air. She had learned much on their journey, and though she was still a young woman, she now carried herself with the certainty of someone who had witnessed history and understood responsibility. "Taza," her father called, his voice strained. "What's all this? You can't just ride into town and—" "Your land claims," Taza interrupted calmly, "must be addressed. The deeds that were stolen belong to my people, and the time has come to restore them." Hensley opened his mouth to protest, but Clara stepped forward. "Father, stop," she said firmly. "He's right. The land wasn't ours to claim, and the people who lived there deserve justice. We've seen it. We've been to the village sites." The townsfolk had begun gathering in the street, curious and wary. Some clutched guns, others leaned against their doors, murmuring. Among them was Deputy Harrow, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for enforcing the law according to his own interests. His eyes narrowed as he took in Taza's figure. "You can't just come in here and make demands, Apache," Harrow said, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "This is our town, our law. You will not have the right to deny justice." Taza finished for him, his voice calm but firm. "I do not seek conflict, but I will act if forced. Your threats mean nothing when the truth is on my side." Harrow's hand twitched, but he hesitated. Taza's reputation had preceded him, and even the deputy knew that provoking him could cost more than the town could afford. Tension hung like a rope ready to snap. Hensley swallowed hard. "Clara, this is madness. You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand more than you think," Clara said. "I understand that hiding behind wealth and lies will not erase the wrongs of the past. This is our chance to make it right." A single shot rang out, sharp and deliberate. Everyone froze. Taza had fired a warning shot into the dirt, a silent signal that he meant business but would not harm without cause. The echo rolled through the street, and the mob instinctively stepped back. Taza dismounted and moved toward Hensley, slow and deliberate. "Sign the deeds," he said. "Restore the land. Admit the truth." Hensley's pride faltered, and finally, under Clara's unwavering gaze, he drew a deep breath and reached for the ink and paper. Hands trembling, he signed the documents, acknowledging the land as Apache territory and renouncing the stolen claims. The crowd murmured, some with disbelief, some with grudging respect. Deputy Harrow's jaw tightened, but even he could not argue against the evidence or the quiet authority of Taza's presence. Clara stepped beside her father. "It's done," she said softly. "Now we can start to make it right." Taza nodded once, then turned, walking back to his horse. "Remember," he said, "justice is not something won in a single day. It is something lived in every choice you make after this." The desert wind stirred the dust around them, carrying the sound of hooves as Taza rode out of town. For the first time, Prosperity Wells seemed different, less like a place of convenience and greed, more like a land whose history demanded acknowledgement. Clara watched him disappear into the horizon, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost and what could now be rebuilt. And in that moment she realized the true weight of courage, not in holding power, but in facing the truth no matter how difficult. The showdown had ended without bloodshed, yet it had left an imprint on everyone who witnessed it. A lesson in honor, justice, and the cost of inherited sins. A reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with guns, but with conscience. The sun was high and harsh when Clara and her father returned to the Lazy H Ranch, documents in hand. The deed transfers had been completed in Prosperity Wells that morning. The town had watched the events unfold, the confrontation, the signing, the calm authority of Taza, and now the papers sat in Clara's satchel, proof that justice had been done. Jacob Hensley moved slowly across the veranda, his shoulders stooped, his pride bruised but his conscience relieved. He had expected shame, scorn, and perhaps violence, but instead he had found clarity. He looked at Clara, her face set in determination, and realized she had grown far beyond the sheltered girl who had once studied the world only from her books. "It's finished," he said quietly. "The land, it's no longer ours," Clara nodded. "It's theirs, Father, and we'll help them protect it. That's what matters now." For a long moment they stood together, looking out over the northern pasture where the fences still marked the boundary of what had once been Apache land. The wind stirred the grass, carrying the faint scent of sage and desert flowers, a reminder that the land itself had survived centuries of human folly. Later, Taza returned, not as an adversary but as a guide. He rode up slowly, the afternoon sun glinting off his buckskin coat. "The documents are in order?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, stepping forward. "Everything is signed and acknowledged. Your people have the legal claim back." Taza dismounted, scanning the horizon. "Restoring the land is one step. Protecting it, teaching respect for it, that is another. Your father has begun the first step. You, Clara, can carry it further." She nodded. "I will." Clara dismounted first, standing tall despite the tension in the air. She had learned much on their journey, and though she was still a young woman, she now carried herself with the certainty of someone who had witnessed history and understood responsibility. "Taza," her father called, his voice strained. "What's all this? You can't just ride into town and—" "Your land claims," Taza interrupted calmly, "must be addressed. The deeds that were stolen belong to my people, and the time has come to restore them." Hensley opened his mouth to protest, but Clara stepped forward. "Father, stop," she said firmly. "He's right. The land wasn't ours to claim, and the people who lived there deserve justice. We've seen it. We've been to the village sites." The townsfolk had begun gathering in the street, curious and wary. Some clutched guns, others leaned against their doors, murmuring. Among them was Deputy Harrow, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for enforcing the law according to his own interests. His eyes narrowed as he took in Taza's figure. "You can't just come in here and make demands, Apache," Harrow said, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "This is our town, our law. You will not have the right to deny justice." Taza finished for him, his voice calm but firm. "I do not seek conflict, but I will act if forced. Your threats mean nothing when the truth is on my side." Harrow's hand twitched, but he hesitated. Taza's reputation had preceded him, and even the deputy knew that provoking him could cost more than the town could afford. Tension hung like a rope ready to snap. Hensley swallowed hard. "Clara, this is madness. You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand more than you think," Clara said. "I understand that hiding behind wealth and lies will not erase the wrongs of the past. This is our chance to make it right." A single shot rang out, sharp and deliberate. Everyone froze. Taza had fired a warning shot into the dirt, a silent signal that he meant business but would not harm without cause. The echo rolled through the street, and the mob instinctively stepped back. Taza dismounted and moved toward Hensley, slow and deliberate. "Sign the deeds," he said. "Restore the land. Admit the truth." Hensley's pride faltered, and finally, under Clara's unwavering gaze, he drew a deep breath and reached for the ink and paper. Hands trembling, he signed the documents, acknowledging the land as Apache territory and renouncing the stolen claims. The crowd murmured, some with disbelief, some with grudging respect. Deputy Harrow's jaw tightened, but even he could not argue against the evidence or the quiet authority of Taza's presence. Clara stepped beside her father. "It's done," she said softly. "Now we can start to make it right." Taza nodded once, then turned, walking back to his horse. "Remember," he said, Justice is not something won in a single day. It is something lived in every choice you make after this. The desert wind stirred the dust around them, carrying the sound of hooves as Taza rode out of town. For the first time, Prosperity Wells seemed different, less like a place of convenience and greed, more like a land whose history demanded acknowledgement. Clara watched him disappear into the horizon, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost and what could now be rebuilt. And in that moment she realized the true weight of courage, not in holding power, but in facing the truth no matter how difficult. The showdown had ended without bloodshed, yet it had left an imprint on everyone who witnessed it. A lesson in honor, justice, and the cost of inherited sins. A reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with guns, but with conscience. The sun was high and harsh when Clara and her father returned to the Lazy H Ranch, documents in hand. The deed transfers had been completed in Prosperity Wells that morning. The town had watched the events unfold, the confrontation, the signing, the calm authority of Taza, and now the papers sat in Clara's satchel, proof that justice had been done. Jacob Hensley moved slowly across the veranda, his shoulders stooped, his pride bruised, but his conscience relieved. He had expected shame, scorn, and perhaps violence, but instead he had found clarity. He looked at Clara, her face set in determination, and realized she had grown far beyond the sheltered girl who had once studied the world only from her books. "It's finished," he said quietly. "The land, it's no longer ours," Clara nodded. "It's theirs, Father, and we'll help them protect it. That's what matters now." For a long moment they stood together, looking out over the northern pasture where the fences still marked the boundary of what had once been Apache land. The wind stirred the grass, carrying the faint scent of sage and desert flowers, a reminder that the land itself had survived centuries of human folly. Later, Taza returned, not as an adversary but as a guide. He rode up slowly, the afternoon sun glinting off his buckskin coat. "The documents are in order?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, stepping forward. "Everything is signed and acknowledged. Your people have the legal claim back." Taza dismounted, scanning the horizon. "Restoring the land is one step. Protecting it, teaching respect for it, that is another. Your father has begun the first step. You, Clara, can carry it further." She nodded. "I will."